Welcome to Madlit Musings, the podcast where we dive into the minds of authors, exploring the profound realms of faith, social issues, and the delightful world of entertainment. I'm your host, Jamie Jo Wright, and on this literary journey, you never quite know what you're going to get. Hey there, Madlit enthusiasts. Our podcast is sponsored by the esteemed Baker Publishing Group. Whether you're into heartwarming romance, gripping suspense, or deep dives into matters of faith and society, Baker Publishing Group has it all. With Revell and Bethany House publishers under their umbrella, they bring you a diverse array of books that will captivate your mind and stir your soul. Check out all of their line at www.bakerbookhouse.com. Hi everyone, it is Jamie Jo Wright here with Madlit Musings, and I'm thrilled today to have with us Tessa Afshar. Welcome. I'm so pleased to have you here.
Jamie, it's fabulous to be with you and I don't know, is it your listeners or your viewers?
Well, both. I have YouTube and listeners on podcasts, so it's both.
It's fun to join both.
Yes. Well, it's great to have you here, and I'm excited to talk about your new release and then also just about faith and everything that, goes into a good chat around coffee. Who knows where we're going to go today, but
Right. I don't drink coffee. Am I still allowed to talk because I drink tea?
that's okay. We can make concessions for tea drinkers.
Thank you.
I have to do that quite often. I make the assumption that everyone drinks coffee, and I've been put in my place many times that we're not all coffee drinkers.
Some of us would love to be, and it smells really good, but we can't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. My husband's the same. He's like, I love the smell, but no, it doesn't work. So just the smell is fine. Well, you have a book coming out in November, and it is called The Queen's Cook.
Yes.
So let's start there and tell us a little bit about this.
So as we are recording this, obviously it's in the middle of summer and
Right.
the book is not anywhere near ready, but I have a picture. See?
Hey, look at that. That's great.
This is the first book in a new series of 3 books, and it is a series that's placed or located during the time of Queen Esther. Queen Esther is not the central character. She's a support character in all 3 books. We hear from her through these scrolls, these secret scrolls, and by the end of book 1, we discover who she's writing those to. So we hear from her throughout the book a little bit in first person as an older woman. And but the main characters of the books are actually 3 women who have interesting jobs. At least from my perspective, they're interesting jobs, and they end up working for Queen Esther and becoming her friends. And so it's just
cool.
Obviously there's some romance in all my books, but there is also this thread of friendship building between an ordinary woman and a woman who's a queen. So
Yeah. And Esther is such a heroine of scripture. I remember being a little girl and I was like, I want to grow up to be just like Esther.
yeah, I mean, what's funny for me is I grew up in the Middle East, so I am Persian by birth, and I lived there for the first 13 years of my life. So I heard the stories about the kings that are mentioned in the Bible, because those biblical kings belong to a dynasty called the Achaemenid dynasty, and that was like the most famous dynasty, royal dynasty, or one of the most famous royal dynasties in Persian history. So I'm aware of the kings, and I know the stories of the kings. But Esther's tomb is in Persia. It's still in Persia.
Really?
And I've never met. It's empty, so whatever was in there has been taken during the centuries. But I've never visited it myself. My uncle has been, and it's kind of like this small memorial to
Yeah.
the queen. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. She was always, obviously I was raised in the United States, obviously, and I went
Right,
to Sunday
right,
school as a little girl.
right.
And when I was little in Sunday school, they would use flannel graph, which I'm assuming you know what that is. And so they would have these pictures, and I was always like the first to volunteer whenever they told the story of Esther, because I wanted to make sure everything got placed exactly where it was supposed to go on the flannel graph. So the
Yeah,
teachers would let
yeah.
me come up and I'd put the picture of Queen Esther and then the king and then, Haman and all. It was just it was a true story, and yet it just enveloped my imagination and my senses. And she was just so beautiful in my mind. So I love that your books are set within that time period and around her. I think that's so neat.
Yeah, I love that you were so possessive that everything had to be in the right place, because that's sort of how
Yes.
I feel about my stories. That
Hmm.
I want everything to be in the right place and as accurate as we can make it. It's a
Right.
tough period to be accurate with, only in that there's a lack of information historically,
Yeah.
and what information we do have is not particularly accurate because a lot of it is written by the enemies. The Greeks
Okay. Hmm.
retained the history, and obviously they didn't like the Persians very much,
Right.
for good reason. And so, like the Greeks, for example, at that time, for the Greeks, uh, and it's very ironically, their women were not supposed to meddle in a husband's matter, in any way, in
Hmm.
politics, in any way, in having authority. And they often called the Persian kings effeminate because sometimes they allowed their wives to speak into policy or to give advice or something.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
so for them, this was like a big no-no. Like, he's not
Yeah.
masculine enough or something. Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
ironic.
That is really interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask about that for that time period, because I'm only familiar with the scriptural account of Queen Esther, and yet I know there was so much going on in Persian history, and you don't hear as much of that time period within history being talked about.
Mhm.
So, looking at the series that you have coming out, The Queen's Cook, how did you find information for this story to make sure that it, like you said, it's accurate as possible as you can?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that we do know about the Achaemenids in this period.
Okay.
So my main character, Roxana, is a cook. She's
Okay.
an incredibly talented cook. She ends up getting a job. She's the daughter of an impoverished Persian lord, and she ends up getting a job in Queen Esther's kitchens, starting sort of on the bottom rung. And this is unusual. So we do know that there were women who worked as cooks, but they were not that many. And so she immediately has an issue with the fact that the other cooks are jealous. They don't like her because she's a woman. They don't like her because she has
Mm,
a kind of a snobby accent and all of that, and
yeah.
she has to overcome that. So I'm writing this story, and I'm thinking, what are the things that I need to know in terms of my research? I need to know what the kitchens look like. I need to know what she would
Mhm.
be cooking, what ingredients would she be using,
Yeah.
and things like that. So there are things that we do know. We do know, for example, that cooks at this time were held, particularly high, the ones who were like head cooks. They were
Hmm.
held at a higher standard. The king was known to give cooks what are called royal gifts, and these are like, it could be a gold cup, it could be a gold platter, it could be a horse, it could be an outfit, things that belonged to the king himself, that showed that, first of all, very valuable, and also was a mark of his esteem. So the cooks were
Okay.
slightly above other jobs. And the reason for that is not only did they cook, but they came up with new recipes all the time. and they tried new ingredients all the time. Which when you have
Oh.
an empire as big as Persia was at this time, which was, it was a sprawl. It was the biggest empire the world had seen up until that point.
Mhm.
127, I think, different provinces. At any given point, you can have a famine in some part of the country, in some part of the nation, and so they needed to have products that they could replace. So if you were only dependent on barley and wheat, and all of a sudden you had a famine for 2 or 3 years in a row, and
Mhm.
you had no more barley or wheat, you had to be able to say, okay, use this other ingredient so that people are not
Okay.
starving. So
Right.
they were kind of, their position was really important. It wasn't just about
Mhm.
making delicious food. It was also about, there were kind of scientists on the side and all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And then we don't have any surviving recipes from that period. But I'm Persian, so I know how to do Persian cooking, and I
Yay.
have a list, right?
Okay.
And I have access to a list of common ingredients from that time.
Okay.
So I took kind of some of the Persian food that I know of, and I took some of the
Mhm.
common ingredients, and I mashed them together, and there you are.
There you
I
are.
have food.
Oh, that, and now I'm getting hungry because now I wanna ask what are some of the ingredients that they used or that you use?
So the Persians really loved their. They were meat eaters, so they ate different kinds of meat, but they
Mhm.
also loved their sweets. So I have. So they loved herbs and spices. So I have things
Mhm.
like, uh, I think, saffron or
Mm.
turmeric or cardamom or cinnamon, and instead of sugar, which doesn't come into play for a few hundred years,
Right.
maybe 300 or 400 years later, I use a lot of honey and
Okay.
things like that.
Yep.
So a
Yep.
lot of onion and garlic, and also
Mm.
they like to use sweets, so sweet and sour. So you could maybe have
Okay.
a little bit of fruit in your meat,
Okay.
things like that.
All right.
Mhm.
All right. Well, we're gonna end the podcast now so we can go eat. Oh, fun. Oh, neat. So that's so neat that you mentioned that about the cooks. I mean, that's such an integral connection as a reader to make that they were on a more esteemed level because really their creations affected the survival of the people.
Yeah, I think the most obviously these are cooks that are at the higher levels
Right.
and the most successful cooks. But for example, because the Persian kings at this time, they had five capitals, because again their empire was so sprawling. So they had
Okay.
five different cities that on a given year they generally traveled through different times
Mhm.
of the year. And in one of those cities, which is Persepolis, they had over 200 cooks,
Wow.
and each one had specialties. So some were dairy cooks or drink cooks or meat cooks, dessert
Mhm.
cooks, things like that.
Mhm. Wow. That's so fascinating. It's interesting. This is what I love about fiction that's set back in those eras is you learn so much that you had no idea existed. And they're often the smaller pieces of history that don't necessarily make it into an overarching history
I
book.
think that's very true, and I mean, I love your books for this. Our readers don't come to our books because they want to get a bunch of facts.
Right.
They don't come because they want to learn history. Some of them are interested in history, but that's kind of as an aside, and you have to be very careful. I'm not
Mhm.
writing kind of a tour of ancient Persia. I'm writing a
Right.
story. So this is
Right.
a story that hopefully captivates your imagination, your emotions. It's the story about a woman who's grown up with a very broken father, and he's a little too fond of his wine. He's what today we would
Mm.
call an alcoholic, but um, that has made him very mercurial, which means
Mhm.
that she never knows what's going to happen.
Right.
And when you grow up like that, it takes away the ground of your safety. It takes
Mhm.
away your sense of security. You never quite feel at home in your own skin. And I wanted this story to be not only the adventure of her kind of making it in the kitchens, the
Mhm.
adventure of her. She and the palace physician, in whom she's very interested, although it's a forbidden romance because he's Jewish and she's not.
Ooh,
Uh,
okay.
they overhear a plot, and there's this mysterious book, and they have to figure out what's this book, and stop this plot from taking place. They have to save someone's life, um, and while all of that is happening, she's having to figure out, how do I feel safe in a
Mm,
world that, from my perspective, is never secure. At
yeah,
any point, the worst could come to pass.
yeah.
And as her relationship with God kind of develops and grows, she begins learning this issue.
Mm,
Uh,
mhm.
and I think many of us have that wound of needing the security of God. It may not be because we have that kind of father, but different ways. All my
Mhm.
heroes and heroines are always wounded. They don't merely deal with circumstances that are broken, but internally they are
Right,
broken.
right.
And so I want the reader to enter into the emotions, hopefully laugh and honestly cry a little bit
Mhm.
too.
Yeah, yeah.
As they process through that particular wound and come out at the
Mhm.
other end. And my hope is, whoever is uh, kind of reading this, that they would come away at the end of the book feeling in themselves a little more secure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's so I think that's gonna resonate with so many people because really, as a child, you grow up if you are blessed to have a safe home, which your heroine obviously has a more unpredictable environment. But as a child, you grow up wanting that security that your parents offer because to a degree they're the image of God to you, right? You know, they're the ones
Exactly.
protecting you, taking care of you, where they should be. And then you grow up and some of us enter into marriage and might look at our spouse that way, or we might start viewing ourselves as our own protection, however that goes. Um, but you start to realize, like my age now, I'm kind of getting to the point like this whole idea of security in this earth is such a thin veil. It's
Yeah.
so non existent.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I think that our deepest maturity begins when you finally make peace with that. You know,
Yeah.
when you, first of all, you acknowledge it. You think,
Hmm.
all of my illusions of creating control, creating protection for the people I love or for myself, they are just that. They're merely illusions. And that's the point where your trust in God
Hmm.
goes to a whole different level, where you
Yeah.
realize, I am not in charge. I never was. I cannot create even the thinnest layer of
Right.
security. And
Right.
that's all right. That's all
Yep.
right. I do not always have to walk around trying to find some way to control the bad.
Right.
It's all right. I can live knowing that I'm not in control. I can live in peace, even though I
Mm.
know that.
Yeah. I love that. One of my favorite verses became so real to me when I was little. I would crawl up on my grandfather's lap, and he didn't walk very well. He had multiple sclerosis, and so I would always, to spend time with him, have to sit on his lap because that was about as much as we could do. And we would read books together. And I always remembered that feeling of just complete safety, which he probably didn't feel he could offer. But as a little child, I was like, oh, grandpa's so safe. And as I grew, I didn't have that feeling so much anymore in life. And then my mom showed me this verse one day that floored me because for as many times as I've read the Psalms, it had never jumped out. But it was Psalms 4:8, where in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you, our Lord, are my safety. I paraphrased that a little bit, but it reminded me of that concept of crawling up into my grandfather's lap and having no control about the things around me, but being able to rest because somebody else was taking care of it. And it was that element of sleep and safety because someone else was watching over you. And I've loved that verse ever since.
That's so profound. And I also think the image of you in your grandfather's arms, a grandfather who doesn't represent worldly strength. He's got MS. He's
Hmm.
wobbly, and
Yeah.
he probably doesn't think of himself in the context of, I am someone who represents safety.
Right.
And yet I love that he was the particular person with whom you have this connection of safety. The one
Hmm.
who himself in some ways was not safe, who was fragile and weak and at the mercy of this disease. But he wasn't, was he? Because
Well, no,
there was something
no.
about him
Yes.
that brought to you that emotional
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
foundation. It's great.
Yeah. I love that. So, ooh, your book is already giving me goosebumps because if it's exploring these themes, that means it's special and it's going to resonate with a lot of us, I believe. But I do want to ask, you did reference a physician, and I'm assuming there's some romance built into the story as well.
Yes, absolutely. So,
Okay.
Aidan is a palace physician, and he, as a practicing Jew, as a really faithful Jew,
Okay.
recognizes that he could never meld his life with a woman who doesn't believe in God. But he has another issue. He was very in love as a young man. He married a young woman who died of a terrible disease, and
Mm,
so somewhere in his own heart, he's pretty much decided never again am I going to go through that. So he's got
yeah.
these two layers of protection. And
Hmm.
yet at the same time, his heart is, it keeps kind of being drawn to this woman. It keeps being drawn to this woman. And so they have to figure that out.
All right. This is so cool. I love it. Well, the book releases in November.
Yes.
And if you're listening to this podcast, yes, we recorded it in July, midsummer. So by the time you're listening to this podcast, it'll probably be a little bit colder outside. But you definitely want to pick up this book. It's called The Queen's Cook. It's written by Tessa Afshar. And
Thank
Tessa,
you. And this is
yeah,
how
look
it looks.
at that. I love it. I love it. And
I don't know
if
how not
readers,
to make it backwards. Have
I don't
you
know. I
figured
just
that?
think I haven't. No, the cameras, there's different things that they say you can mirror the images and stuff, and I've never quite figured it out. But we'll post pictures. We'll make sure everybody sees the cover thoroughly. So we'll make sure that's good. But if readers want to follow you or learn more, because you have a lot of books in your repertoire and you're a beloved author in this time period and this era, how do they follow you and how do they find you?
I think probably the best place to go to find me, uh, and then they can find my socials there as well, is just
Hmm.
come to my little what's that place?
Website?
Uh, yeah, come to my website. Sorry,
That's
I
okay.
could not remember that word, and that is tessaafshar.com. So
Perfect.
TESSAAFSHAR.com. And
All
we
right.
also have newsletters once a month. And I was so focused on newsletter, I wanted to say, come to my newsletter, but you can't unless you go to my website.
There we go.
And I usually have like a free devotional every month
Mm,
and some fun things to give away too.
wonderful. Awesome. Yeah, definitely sign up for the newsletter of any author when you visit their website because there's always such neat stuff that you glean through newsletters that you don't get anywhere else. So,
Yeah, and also I think even if you have some really important things to tell you with social media, it's a hit or miss.
right,
You might see it or not see it.
right. Absolutely.
But that's a whole other show.
I know. Yes, I know. But this is so much fun. I really appreciate your being here today and talking about the Queen's Cook and teaching us about food as it relates to the Persian culture and talking about safety and security. And it sounds like it's going to be a wonderful story. So I just really thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jamie. It's been a delight being with you, and I enjoy your own books. One day we should talk about your books, but thank you for
Okay.
inviting me to hang out with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining Madlit Musings, where every conversation is a journey and every book is a new adventure. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast player or check us out on YouTube, and let's explore the fascinating intersection of faith, society, and storytelling together.